We'll improvise. Should be right. Okay, so we'll just have this is going to be like a kind of a speed read through the last 10 years or so of research and extension work that we've been doing with annual legumes. I'd also like to say on this, Jane Quinn has been heavily involved in this, especially in the last couple of years with working through photosensitization issues and that sort of thing with biserrula. So any specific health questions related to that, Jane's sitting down the back, and don't let her get out the door. All right, so this is sort of the way, I guess, that we think about how these legumes fit into farming systems. And I'm going to pretty much run around all these things when we're talking about them today. So I guess we started off looking at actually getting them into farming systems, and the advantage of these things is that you can harvest them with conventional headers, unlike subclover. So there's the option to produce seed fairly cheaply on farm. We looked initially at some of the benefits that you could get in your cropping system by having these included, so that was part of a previous project. And in the current projects we've got now, we're looking more at animal production with these things. So looking at them in animal production, off them in the vegetative state, and then also they can provide a lot of bulk over the summer period. So starting to look now at the feed value of those things over summer. So we'll have a bit of a run around and have a look at all those things. But for anyone who doesn't know, these are the main things we're talking about. So on your top left, we've got biserrula. Bottom left is gland clover. Over on the other side, you've got bladder clover and then French serradella. So they're the main ones that we've been working with. And they're also very hard seeded, so you've got the capacity to have them in, run crops over them, have them come back without the need for re-sowing. So quite a different system to your normal kind of phase pasture system. I could talk about agronomy all day, but this is a sheep thing, so we'll move on to a few other things. This is really I guess what we're going to highlight in this is how do they differ from what you might be using already. And one of the things that you can do with these is, because they're quite hard seeded, you can harvest them on farm. Biserrula and French serradella particularly are quite deep rooted. You can actually use seed that you harvest on farm without scarifying it, or in the case of serradella, you can use it in the pod as you harvest it, and you can sow it in summer. And you use summer to break down the hard seed. They come up on the first rain and away you go. So you get growth out of them before you actually get to the cold winter temperatures. So this is a picture from up at Greenthorpe where I had a trial last year. The dog there is sitting on some biserrula that was sown as you normally would as scarified seed in May. Over on the right hand side is biserrula that was sown as unscarified seed in late February, and that photo is taken at the start of August. So you know, it's kind of, in terms of your time, preparation, all those sorts of things, it's cost you about the same amount to get to that, but which kind of pasture would you rather have as first year pasture? Now that also translated through to have effects on what kind of seed yield you got and those sorts of things as well. So we did that with a range of species. We had 7 or 8 in there, and they varied a little bit, but you know, generally the trend was the summer sown were a lot better. Now we've got those in again this year. Mike does some summer sowing on his place, a lot of summer sowing on his place compared to our little plots. So do you want to say anything at this stage, or?
Oh, well, not particularly. I think it's pretty easy to see. But the other thing, apart from the production by getting it in early, is that it fits your program easy. Like, if you've got a big cropping program and want to sow some pasture, do it in summertime. It's all done, it's out of the road. When you're doing, well, you mightn't be doing nothing else, but you're certainly not going to be cropping. So it's great from that aspect as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now, it's a horses for courses thing in terms of which one you choose for which region you're in. And over on the right-hand side, there's some stuff there on hard seed breakdown. Now, the black line shows for biserrula, they get very poor results if they try to summer sow biserrula in WA. And that's because they get very slow initial hard seed breakdown. Now, in parts of New South Wales, we do too. In Wagga, it's not as good as what it was, say, at that Greenthorpe site. So you've got to have a good understanding of hard seed breakdown and what particular one will fit the soils you've got, the type of climate you're in and the system you're trying to run. So it's not a case of just deciding you want to grow that thing. Make sure you grow the right thing for your purposes. Now, in terms of, I think I got them around the wrong way. In terms of other advantages that we've been seeing with summer sowing, this was taken at the same time as that previous shot there, but in 2 different species. So this is biserrula, summer sown in February. This is Ceradella, summer sown in February at that Greenthorpe site. This is particularly clean, very low levels of weeds. This one had a lot of capeweed in it. So there's differences between the species in terms of how they can, potentially behave in terms of weed suppression as well. So another advantage of getting them in early is you can get that suppression with some of the species. And that's shown a little more here. If we had a pointer, but anyway, we'll see what we can do with this. Is that going to work? So this is in May, and you have your different species running across here. You have biserrula, bladder clover, gland clover, and then a range of Ceradellas. The blue bar shows you the percentage or the amount of sown species that's in that pasture at that stage, and the red colour is the amount of broadleaf weed. Now that was mainly capeweed at that stage. So you can see that the biserrula has been very, very good at suppressing that as well. If we go to later in the season, and ryegrass, obviously for croppers, is a big thing. Look over here at the summer sows. This is what you've sown in the blue. If there's ryegrass around, it's in red. So you can see that all of those species have been very, very effective in suppressing ryegrass. But if you go over here to the conventional sowing time of late May, you can see that there's more ryegrass in, but there's certain ones there again, so the biserrula and the gland clover, that have been very, very effective in suppressing ryegrass. So there's a few things here. While it's nice for sheep to eat, it's nice if you've got other advantages as well that fit in with your system. So I put this up and I haven't shown Mike, but this is kind of Mike's system, I hope. So over here we have a start with summer sowing, grows the first year, sets seed, comes through to the next year, regenerates, you blow it out about September. So only gets to set seed in the first year, goes into wheat, then canola, canola, then wheat. If I had read my slide, it would have been right too. And then comes back to it for regeneration again. So this is a photo here, and we'll have a bit closer look. I think it's on the next slide. These are taken last year, and this is pasture coming back after a 1 in 4 year seed set. So this hasn't been resown after the cropping phase. This is how it's come back. Okay, so in terms of cost savings, again, that's something to think about. And also in terms of, last year was quite good because we got that early break, but in terms of having a grazable pasture coming out of your cropping rotation. So if you had went in and put in a normal phase pasture system where you had to go back and resow your pasture after cropping, then, you wouldn't have had anything like that at that stage last year. So that's with biserrula. And there's bladder clover there in that other shot. Now, in terms of livestock performance, these were on some of Mike's lambs last year. So they were 4-week-old lambs, went on to biserrula. Now, we talk a lot about biserrula, but it's been so successful that, we kind of concentrated on it a little bit by default. Doesn't mean we're ignoring the others. So these lambs were on their mothers on a biserrula pasture for 8 weeks. And this is the live weight gain that we got on average, which ran at 350 grams per head per day over that period. We split them up and we had a look at the weather portion and the ewe portion. The wethers went at about 380 grams per head per day and the ewes at 335. So they're fairly respectable weight gain figures on a pasture. We did some additional stuff here at the uni, and we had Merino lambs that were on their mothers. That's in the blue, the Merino ewes themselves. Then we had Merino lambs that were on a naturalised pasture, so mainly, just a volunteer pasture, fair bit of barley grass, a little bit of clover, those sorts of things. And so the ewes and the lambs were repeated on those. And then we just had some of Mike's sheep that we brought in for a holiday, and they were run only on the biserrula pasture. So the interesting thing to look at here really is the lambs were growing at more than double the rate of their counterparts on a volunteer pasture when they were grazing biserrula. The ewes were actually gaining weight on the biserrula and at a pretty respectable level of around about 200 grams per head per day, whereas they were going backwards on the naturalised pasture. So, you know, if you can have a ewe that's lactating and gaining weight, that's a pretty nice place to be in, especially if that ewe's, say, on a last lamb and you want to get her out the gate pretty quickly afterwards. Now, the other thing that was interesting in this trial is we had both varieties of biserrula that are available in. So there was Casbar, which is the harder seeded one. It was the first one released. And then there's Mauro, which is slightly softer seeded. The interesting thing that we found with this, the blue line shows you total dry matter over the grazing period. The red line or the orange line shows you the biserrula dry matter. So you can see here with the Casbar, it started off better anyway in terms of the proportion of biserrula that we had in there, and there seems to be competitive differences with these two varieties. But what happened over time was everything else, which in this trial was mainly ryegrass, was removed in the Casbar. It didn't happen in the Mauro. So there's possibility there for varietal selection when you choose to sow something, depending on whether you want to have a mixed pasture, say if you're just mainly sheep, or if you're running a cropping system and ryegrass is a problem to you, you might choose the one that is perhaps slightly less palatable. But then again, the palatability issues aren't that great, really, when you look at how well they were growing. So people often say, oh, but they don't eat it, it's not palatable. Well, you know, more than 90% of the feed on offer at the time that they went on was biserrula, and they grew at, you know, over 250 grams per head per day. So it's got a little bit going for it. Now, in terms of dry residue, Jane did do some studies this year, and I haven't included them mainly just because of time, but we will do more this year. This is an interesting case. This is in WA with Anna and Colin Butcher, who have actually taken on French Cerridella as their main hard-seeded legume species, and they have half their farm under crop, and they're basically 50-50, a bit like Mike. So, being in WA, lovely sand dunes and that sort of thing, doesn't hold much moisture, and they were spending a lot of money on supplementary feeding over summer. So Anna did some budgeting and worked out what it was costing them prior to introduction of Margarita French Cerridella on their place, in terms of the actual grain supplement costs and then their actual labour costs as well, both over the summer period and then during their lambing period. And you can see there that it was quite considerable when you add the two up together. On the Margarita, there's a little token one there. Anna calls that, I can't remember exactly, but basically that's her right the fat sheep costs there. So their sheep are huge, and they get very, very, very big on the Margarita, which probably suggests they need more sheep. So she has to just drive around and roll the odd one upright. But but she said it's much more rewarding than actually having to run around and feed out. The other thing they've done too, since 2012, they've calculated in terms of fertiliser cost and spreading costs. They've saved about $200,000 since 2012 on urea as well. So they call it variable rate fertiliser technology by legume, really. Okay, so quickly, a couple of other things. Now, these are aerial seeding legumes. So unlike sub, which produces burr very close to the ground or underground, as you know, these things set their seed above ground. So there's often a lot of talk around about, you know, they're a little bit soft and you have to be careful of them because you can take all the pods off and that sort of thing, and that's right to a degree. But we did a little bit of work this year, and some of this stuff is from Mike's. You haven't seen this yet either, Mike. But the blue line here is for biserrula, and in a paddock of Mike's, I just had fixed points where we recorded end of season dry matter across here, so in late spring when it had all senesced, and then went back to the same spots and looked at autumn regeneration this year. Now the interesting thing was, if you get down to 1 tonne of dry matter, senescent material, we were getting over 1,200 plants per square metre coming up there with the biserrula. So its capacity to recruit is pretty good. This was Jane's trial at CSU, where we had heavy grazing over summer, so they were on it somewhere around about 15 DSE. And you can see again there that at a tonne of residual dry matter, you're still getting about 850 plants per square metre. And we've actually, we apologise because we smell like sheep. We've just been putting sheep on the trial up there today. So it's, you know, it's nice grazable height. There's probably about 2.5 tonnes on there now. Bladder clover, you can see down here, perhaps a little bit more sensitive. Okay, so the seed heads are slightly more prominent. Biserrula sets seed right along its runners. Ceradella is more, bladder clover is more in a discrete little seed head. And it's also a bigger seed. So biserrula, about 60% passes through the animal and is still viable. So that can be a pretty effective way to move it around your paddocks as well. And we see that. I had to knock back my first site last year based on the fact that there was too much biserrula in the paddock from the sheep carting it through the door, and that was a really nice feeling. With the French Ceradella, now Ceradellas are extremely palatable, and particularly French Ceradellas, and you can see down here that at 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare, we weren't getting much regeneration in those ones. Now the actual pod of Ceradella is quite digestible too, so you're getting a lot of that material, if it's taken in as fully formed pod, is actually being digested by the animal. So again, there's that species difference that you've got to think about there in terms of how do you graze them over summer and all those sorts of things. And we'll do a lot more on that, but basically it'll boil down to seed size and those sort of things. So the more you can get going through the animal that's viable, the lower you can take your dry matter over summer. Okay, so this is again just quickly a mic thing, but the thing I suppose I see most when people are wanting to get into these is, you know, they decide they're going to sow some and they think they'll do their favourite one, you know, first 1,000 hectares or something. You don't have to jump in the water quite that much. Mike started in 2009 with 5 to 8 hectare nursery strips of these things, and those paddocks are still there. So, and then the seeds harvested, you know, seed harvested, bulked up, and spread around the pasture, and up to about 2,000 hectares by last year. Yeah. So, you know, it can be a pretty rapid progression because you're producing your seed on farm. The other advantage with that too is if you're producing it on farm, you can afford to sow more of it. And at the end of the day, the success of your establishment is a numbers game. Now, another little interesting thing too to think about here, and I'm sorry if I'm running over time, but I won't be too much longer, is just how tough these species are. Now, 2009 was a pretty brave year to start with these things, and this is, I've put a bit bigger picture in here. This is how they looked in 2009 out at Mike's. So it doesn't look particularly spectacular, but compared to, you know, naturalised paddocks that were running around, that sort of thing, it was a whole lot better. I did have a photo from 2010 that showed the regeneration, but I haven't put that one in here. But this is the same, basically in a similar area of the paddock. It's still the biserrula area. This is how it came back after that 1 year in 4 seed set, okay, following from when it went into the crop rotation. So they don't need a lot of juice in terms of rain to actually get seed set. And I think Mike did some measurements on bladder clover in 2009, which was, if it was lucky, it was 10 centimetres in diameter, and it was producing, was it 300? I think it was about 300 seeds per plant on that, yeah.
More pods than leaves. Amazing. Yeah.
So they've got a tremendous will to live. So I think, you know, it's not a case of with the grazing strategy and that, because you'll see a lot of stuff about their aerial seeding, they're delicate, you know, that kind of thing. Where these things come from, in the Mediterranean, the Greek islands, those sort of areas, they don't really have pro-graze, you know. They've done quite well there. If it's green, you get used. So, you know, they're pretty well adapted to being treated not particularly well. So, not that you do that all the time, but, you know, they're not a delicate little wallflower or anything by any means. Now, in terms of photosensitization, I won't say too much about it. If you've got questions about it, Jane's still here. But biserrula, you can get photosensitization on it. It's a primary photosensitization. Cameron Allen put it quite well in terms of summing up probably its impact on production. he said it's a little bit like him wearing shorts and having varicose veins. It didn't affect his ability to wear shorts. It just wasn't as pleasant to look at. And basically that's where, you know, where it fits in terms of losses of production, because those figures that I showed you from the Wagga trial up here, we had primary photosensitization in those sheep and they were still doing more than 250 grams per head per day in those lambs. And pigmentation, those kind of things, Jane's looked at that. That can help if you're in a prime lamb kind of operation as well. But in terms of what you can get with other things, so, you know, a little bit of cosmetic effects down here, but, you know, red gut up the other end, dead animals don't grow very well. Okay, so got to keep it in context. And that's it. So if Mike's got questions.
All right, we will move into a panel session in